back. I'm Kimberly, he's Jamie Watley, and this is Inside Exec. We're continuing our discussion with Kate O'Neill, and this time for this session, we go a little bit more in depth into how business leaders and managers can use AI in a better way to assist with their roles in organisations.
Next question goes more towards the strategic disappointment side of the discussion. Have good leaders always recognised the existence of strategic disappointment?
I think that they have. It's a term that I made up and never saw anyone else discussing. But I think that good leaders have always understood that discussion on some level. I feel like it shows up in classic sayings about how lonely it is at the top. You know, we've kind of understood that, right? But I think what's different now is when I name it explicitly as strategic disappointment, I'm trying to treat it as a skill to develop and not just something to endure. And I think that what happens is that, you know, great leaders recognize that they want buy-in and support for their decisions, but ultimately they have to own those choices. And that sometimes can mean making calls that are disappointing or frustrating for people and that people may disagree with. You might be investing in one initiative over another or choosing a direction that not everyone agrees with. That's the point. That's what leadership is. It's being intentional about those choices and understanding that you're making a deciding vote, but that you're trying really hard to make sure that you're deciding with the best possible vision in mind, and not just for short-term wins, but for what creates lasting meaning and value.
So what led you to coining that phrase, to thinking that there was a need for people to recognise and develop that ability of strategic disappointment?
Well, it relates to me to this term I've been using for years, which is strategic optimism. And this is a concept in my work and has been for a long time. I wrote about it significantly in my book, A Future So Bright, which came out in 2021. But I've been talking about it for a couple of years before that. It's this idea that you're actively choosing where to focus your resources and energy, right? Like strategic optimism is not about, you know, saying everything's going to be great, right? Like, but you're saying, I recognize that there are risks and harms and I need to manage those. And at the same time, I need to figure out what it is I'm actually trying to accomplish and lean my resources into that. But I find that when you think about that concept long enough and you talk about it enough and you sort of apply it enough in get consultative engagements that I've had the opportunity to witness how it plays out, there is this kind of companion piece, which is once you decide where you're going to invest those resources, there can be this sense that people are disappointed by the focus, by the direction that you've chosen. But the direction that you've chosen for a very good reason, hopefully. You've chosen it with the clearest and best of intentions. And so now you need to own that. And you need to own the communication of that. You need to own the process of making sure that people come along on this emotional journey with you and that you manage the mental process of handling their disappointment and making those tough calls and being transparent and clear about your reasoning while remaining confident in your decision. So that's the companion pieces of strategic optimism and strategic disappointment, I think, are very, very useful leadership skills just in general for anyone across the board.
So are we really talking about, we touched on it briefly very early, about emotional intelligence in terms of leadership? So is this going to be the guiding light of our leadership skills, is to have that emotional intelligence and to recognise it in others that we're developing through the leadership phases?
Yeah. As I mentioned this earlier in the conversation, that I'm often asked about what are the skills that people will have, that people will be able to cultivate in light of this increasingly AI-driven workplace. And that's what always comes back to me is what we've traditionally almost like insulted as soft skills. Like we've been like, oh, soft skills, sure, take a little course and get a certificate on the side for those, right? Like the emotional intelligence and the context and the judgment calls and the ability to form relationships and develop rapport with people and all those kinds of things we've sort of been like, sure, that's important. Yeah. But not really meant it. And those actually turn out to be the most human skills of all in the context of machinery that does an incredibly job at more things than any of the experts even predicted that it would do. These generative AI tools and all of the sort of the classes of emerging AI are doing such a great job at creativity, which we thought was a stronghold of humanity, and at being able to make reasoned decisions, which we thought was a stronghold of humanity. And not that we don't have incredible, faceted and nuanced capabilities in both of those areas, in creativity and in reasoned decision making, but we really have that emotional intelligence, and we really have the ability to do this kind of contextual light shedding, right? To be able to understand like why we're making the decisions we're making. What's the meaning? What's the purpose? What can we bring as humans to that decision making that machines do not have access to at this point? And so I do see those complementary skills as being what we really, really ought to be leaning into at this moment.
One of our early guests this year, I think, was Oscar Trimboli. He talked about deep listening. And so the listening obviously is one of the soft skills that we dance around.
Get a little certificate in, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I have done this. I can hear you, yes. Increasingly, when we're using AI, we're reading, we don't really consider it listening. So is there a different combination of the skills that we can identify now as individual skills that we're also going to have to develop?
Yeah. So it's funny. I actually I just did my first ever TEDx talk a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, it was exciting. Thank you. And so maybe by the time this is going to air, that we will have a link to be able to share with folks. But one of the things I talk about in that is a 3-part framework that I use with executives when they're using AI to help make decisions. Because what happens with generative AI, I'm talking specifically large language models, using something like ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, and you're asking it something and getting something back, and it feels like conversation, and it feels like you're talking to another human, a really smart human who's making really sound assessments of what you're asking about, and by the way, flattering the heck out of you, and just saying, that sycophancy, right? That tendency to say like, "Ooh, good idea," like, well observed, you. Gosh, you're just so smart. And that tendency makes us a little bit blind to the rationality or to the sense of what we're reading. And so one of the recommendations I do in this 3-step framework is I call it unname it. So instead of going along with the words and the language that these tools are generating, you're stepping back and you're thinking like, what is this actually saying? What is this actually describing in my human experience as a person who lives in a body, who lives in the world and has senses and has, my memory and hindsight and observation? How can I deeply contextualize experientially what's being described here? And if this sounds like nothing, like superfluous, nothingness, once I've thought it through on that level, then don't accept it. Don't accept it. Just push back and keep looking for something deeper and you can add to it. You can add something to the prompt that you're using, or to, kind of like, well, I think ChatGPT that you've gotten awfully close, but you're missing this really important detail, which is that when you ride a bike out into the wind is pushing against you. It doesn't understand physics. It doesn't understand anything that hasn't been described in enough examples by other humans that's made it into its corpora, into the data set that it's absorbed in order to regurgitate that for you. So you have to be the one who's bringing that deeply experiential understanding of what it is to live, what it is to be alive and human, and how you can bring that into the reality of the work that you're putting forth. So I think that process is one that I think is going to be an incredible asset going forward, that ability to interact with AI, use the tools very, very well, and be sure we're bringing the best of our own experiences to balance out the the sort of efficiency of those tools, because they'll come up with answers very, very fast, but they won't necessarily have life to them. And we need to bring the life.
I like that. One of the areas that we have talked continuously about on this podcast is accurate speaking. And so I think this comes back into that realm as well, in that when we're preparing the prompts, we need to be as accurate as we can about the information we're giving in so that it is a relevant answer. I've had experience in the last 3 months or so of developing a judging system for floral art. So it's art with flowers, which I'm very involved in outside of these activities. And it's the first time that an online competition globally has been judged this way. Of course, there's lots of naysayers because they think that only humans can judge a work of art. And so there's been all of that. But in the process of that, of looking at how the images would be uploaded, how they would be assessed, and the weighting, depending on what the class title was of the principles and elements of design, has been a real education for me. And I will say that I got to a point with it where it was telling me things and I had to say, no, this is not right. You're not understanding that I have this level of account, so I can't access the things that you think you're seeing or that should be there on the screen. They're just not there on my screen. And once in, I think, 6 weeks of interactions, I got it to say, oh, my bad. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, my bad indeed. Yeah, no, that's really an interesting case study of it. And I think the point you're making too is one that really deeply applies to so many of us, because one of the things I think we overlook thinking about this discussion, for example, of whether students should learn to use ChatGPT or should be using ChatGPT or the like of ChatGPT to write essays. I think that discussion overlooks a really important factor, which goes back to my how can we help humanity prepare for an increasingly tech-driven future. We need to prepare young people to interact in a world where prompting is a really common modality of problem solving. And not only that, but prompting, as you describe it, being very specific and accurate and so on, is incredibly similar to delegating to other humans, right? And setting the qualifying characteristics for what makes success. So if you're working with someone else on a team or you're managing someone and you need to specify, here's a task I would like you to do. I would like you to make sure that you do it by Friday. I would like you to make sure that you do it in such a way that it's well documented so that the next person to do this task is able to follow along and do the same steps that you did. You know, you're being very clear and precise about the outcomes you expect and what will determine whether that person is successful in how they do that task. There's not that much difference between that and setting up a very good prompt. So I think this is a basic skill that we're all getting better at, but especially students, you know, coming into the world that is going to be so richly informed by generative AI and agentic AI, which for the moment is very prompt driven too. That's going to be really, really important for them.
I guess when you talk about the students, you know, I always worry that, as you say, a good prompt, you know, leads to a good answer. But now we're learning that no one prompts better than AI does. So, you know, I often say, this is the scenario, write me a really good prompt, and it'll come up with details I wouldn't come up with myself. And I guess my concern is it reducing our cognitive load too much to the stage where we're suffering as a result? Because, I think it's human nature. If there's an easier way to get something done, we'll often take advantage of that. And that's not a bad thing. We drive our cars rather than walk or use public transport. But when it comes to things like our thinking, I think it's a really dangerous territory to have this powerful, all-knowing oracle type tool that can offload a whole heap of stuff too. And in a lot of ways, people use it. Well, I've got acquaintances who use it as a therapist as well. Maybe it doesn't have emotion, maybe it does, or maybe it knows enough about ours to be able to...
It doesn't have emotion. I'll go on record. It doesn't have emotion.
Okay, cool.
That's my hot take for today.
Okay, I'm going to jot that down. But yeah, that's where my concerns lie.
Yeah.
And I see people at restaurants both holding their phones, probably talking to each other. And is that going to become worse as time goes by because of our interaction with generative AI and AI in whatever forms we see it into the future? But I don't know. I digress a little bit there, but I'd be
No, I
interested to
don't
hear your
think you
take on it.
digress, Jamie. I think that you're speaking some very valid and common concerns. I think those things are things that I often hear people ask and express concern about. I think for one thing, to my mind, it is not necessarily the case that if we get good at asking an AI to write a prompt that can better get a result from AI, that necessarily means that we're not cognitively involved. We're just cognitively involved at more of a supervisory level or an executive level, which I don't think that we would necessarily say that being an executive is not a difficult or challenging thing to do. I think that we would all
Dangerous
probably
territory
agree. Right. Now that's a little dangerous. But I think any of us who have truly operated in that executive level, where you're trying to just kind of, if you conceptualize that sort of org chart way of thinking about things, like here's the work happening at these levels, and then it's getting rolled up into management and rolled up into management and rolled up into management. And your job is to make sure that the right level of clarity is flowing down through those tasks. The right level of direction is flowing down through those tasks. It isn't necessarily your job to be very specific all the way down about the level of detail that should be directed and so on. So I think if we allow ourselves the metaphor of moving further into an executive advisory role with the tools that we're overseeing, that's not so bad, but it does require us to stay very present in the process. And that's not necessarily the way people are using these tools now. So that's an improvement that many of us could stand to make, and one that hopefully we'll learn to do as we get better and better at using the tools. But I think that the other concern you bring up about social interactions, very valid also, but I think also a conflating with what's happening in the realm of sort of social media and the distancing effect of filter bubbles and algorithmic optimization. That's not so wonderful that those things are happening simultaneously, but I think we have a set of issues to try to unpack and figure out how do we make the best of the situation that we find ourselves in, where we've got, this kind of muddle of technologies that are changing the way we interact with one another, and maybe not necessarily for the better. So how can we make that better? How can we get the best out of that situation?
Yeah, I
Not
think
clear
what you're saying
answers.
there. Yeah, I think that's true. I think as long as we're aware that there is a challenge, if I can use that well overused word, in this area, I think that's a big part of the answer straight away, but just not give into it without thinking about it. So, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Once again, it's time for a break in this very lively discussion with Kate O'Neill. Join us for part 3. For now, I'm Kim Bailey, he's Jamie Wadley, and this is Inside Exec.